Thanks again for your patience and everything else. As you can see, the title of my project is Hip Hop Family in the Underground, the words and actions of the True School community in Atlanta, Georgia. And thank you for coming. Basic introduction. This presentation highlights my observations while spending time with underground hip hop heads in Atlanta. Hip hop is a deep and complicated present and past, and you really can't do justice to it inside of a course or inside of a short presentation like this. So I'm just gonna provide some basic knowledge of how I came to this topic, how I approached this research, some of the specifics about what I learned and why I think it's important. So we're gonna cover a little history, a little bit of how True School fits in the underground and how underground fits in hip hop, how True Schoolers see themselves as a community, and how that community can work as a safety net, and then compare that against some community models that academics have provided us before going to some community or some concluding thoughts. So why study hip hop? Hip hop is the fastest growing culture worldwide, and while it may not be as important in the mainstream media here in the United States, it's massive worldwide. It's the way that many people understand blackness. African Americans understand African Americanness through hip hop. People of other ethnicities, people of any class understand blackness through hip hop. It's just kind of the way things are right now. A lot of young people are into this, so if you have important things you want to talk about, you can talk about them through hip hop. Hip hop touches all aspects of our lives these days. You can study just about anything through hip hop. And from what I understand and from what I've experienced, there isn't a lot of on-the-ground field work in hip hop. A lot of people talk to a few musicians, a lot of people do history or historiography, but there isn't a lot of on-the-ground work with hip-hop communities, and that's what I'm focused on, is community in hip-hop versus culture in hip-hop. My basic research questions are, what is underground hip-hop? How does True School fit into this? Do True Schoolers function as a community as they say they do? And do their actions meet up with their words? They have an ethos that they describe, a rhetoric that they describe in their lyrics and in their interviews, and I wanted to see if that matches up with their actions, and I was able to do that by checking as if it worked as a safety net, if they worked as a safety net in a time of duress, specifically for two elders, Minister Server and Professor Griff, who I'm going to talk about in a little bit. So how did I approach these questions? I started with a literature review, a couple of them focusing on hip-hop history, on concepts like gender, on black nationalism, on just ethnicity, and on what underground meant to all of that. And with that basic framework, I was able to begin accessing the community. Basically, I got access because of Minister Server. I have a long-standing friendship with an elder in the community who's a gatekeeper, but one of the reasons I was able to get access to him is because I am a community radio station DJ. I was a social activist during my undergraduate years. And I'm committed to a similar ideology to the one that he espouses in his own activism. So I focused primarily on qualitative methods. I did a lot of participant observation inside and outside of Atlanta, and this involved going to shows, going to cultural events, talking to people in their homes, going to bars, going to clubs, meeting people on the street, cold calling people in any number of venues. But the majority of it came from 17 semi-structured interviews across 3 trips to Atlanta with a total of 1 month on the ground. And I found that these 17 people made up what I later understood as a True School community. I also tried to do some quantitative methods. I used structured interviews, a survey that I administered to 140 people. Hip-hop's an oral tradition, it's a performative tradition. Hip-hoppers don't like surveys. I don't like surveys either, and I'm not gonna administer surveys in hip-hop again. Maybe online. So, the main research setting that I was involved in was Atlanta, Georgia. Atlanta, Georgia is important for a lot of reasons. It is understood as kind of a black mecca in America. It was one of the first cities to have an African American mayor back in the early 70s, and waves of migrating African Americans back to the South ended up focusing on Atlanta as a center point because of growing business for African Americans. It was highlighted, these businesses were highlighted in magazines like Ebony and Jet in the late 80s, the Johnson family of media, and shows like A Different World and Spike Lee's School Days showcased this growing, prosperous future for African Americans in Atlanta. The Olympics were bringing money to this same region, And there are several historic black universities like Spelman and Morehouse in the area that provide an intellectual basis. All of this drew African Americans to the South, to Atlanta, and among them were a large group of hip-hoppers. It ended up becoming like this retirement community of hip-hoppers, and based on the ages, a lot of the people that were retiring there were true schoolers, were these golden age hip-hoppers, and I'm going to talk about the golden age a little bit more here in a minute. So again, 17 people were my direct interviews, and I spent a lot of time doing participant observation with all kinds of people, but I'm just going to talk about my interviewees. I had 6 women and 11 men. The 17 respondents all identified between the ages of 18 and 48. All of them were Atlanta residents or had been Atlanta residents. One of the guys I interviewed had just moved to Athens, but he was still part of this true school community, right? All of them self-identified as working class or lower class that would talk about it. Apparently, talking about financial exchange, economic exchange is kind of taboo in hip-hop culture, and I can deal with that later. If you guys want to talk to me about this after this, we can do that. So all respondents were also avid volunteers at churches, at schools, at radio stations like WRFG Community Radio Station, or in their community at large, like even at the Humane Society, right? And again, it's important to know that 16 out of 17 of the people that I talked to were transplants, mostly from the Northeast. They were part of this diaspora that was coming back to Atlanta, right? So what I really learned about the history of hip-hop is that it folds directly into African American history. And while it is a multicultural production, it is still a reflection of the African American experience, which 2 major things came up in hip-hop and in my studies of the African American experience, was the importance of religion and the importance of performance, right? Religion, these churches, these mosques, these temples, provided community support through education, through social and spiritual outreach, through shelter, through food, through solidarity. And performance went directly into that, either in church or temple spaces or on the street or in some cases in the fields. And what this performance was a reclamation of identity, was a reclamation of personal, physical, and mental space. And you can see this in field songs, you can see this in the gospels, you can see this in the blues, jazz, rock, funk, R&B, and most clearly in hip-hop, which is this heterodoxical fusion of spirituality, of activism, of performance, of reclamation. It is community support in many ways, especially the version that true schoolers espouse. So real quick history of hip-hop. I'm only going to focus on some very small things. Hip-hop history is huge. The first rappers that we understand as rappers, you probably could say, is James Brown and the Last Poets, right? The first DJs were Kool Herc, Afrika Bambaataa, and Grandmaster Flash, and this was roughly 73 to 75 that these guys were doing house parties, block parties, and really, really bringing the culture together. 73 is the beginning of the first wave of underground hip-hop. There was no hip-hop before 73. Afrika Bambaataa was a gang member of the Black Spades. He kind of shifted some of his gang members and his activities into a cultural movement centered around the Universal Zulu Nation. And they were focused on peace, love, unity, and having fun. This was what they espoused. And that same rhetoric carries through into the true school community. Basically, between then and the late 80s, there was a lot of diversification and formalization of the hip-hop industry as a musical and performative industry. And in 1988, there were a wide range of styles present. The West Coast had started making waves. People understood the West Coast through gangster rap. And the Third Coast, what Ronnie Sard calls the Third Coast, or what we now know as the Dirty South in Atlanta, started making waves. And you might understand what was going on by way of like Criss Cross or Naughty by Nature, which were some of the early Southern artists that weren't part of the Miami bass movement, right? So this takes us right up to the Golden Age. The Golden Age is what's most important for us right now. Therese Chaney was the first academic to discuss the Golden Age. She focused on black nationalism and gender politics. Some pretty complicated and interesting stuff. But the Golden Age represents this time when there was diversity and an equitable representation of style and ideas and gender. And true schoolers really, really focus on this golden age of hip-hop and are oftentimes associated with it because the higher-ups in the True School movement now were part and parcel of the golden age in the late 80s and early 90s. And what they brought with them were these intellectual roots of True School thought that can be traced through blackness, through spirituality, through performance, right? Islam, Christianity, black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, all come together to create this foundation that True Schoolers build their ideology on. And I came up against it again and again and again and again in my interviews. And fortunately, Dr. Bro was here to help me kind of bring that together because it was so vast and complex that I really didn't know what was going on. You can see this manifest in the ideology of the Universal Zulu Nation's Infinity Lessons and the Temple of Hip Hop's Declaration of Peace, writings by authors like the Black Dot, Hip Hop Ministry's Spiritual Beliefs, or the Hustler's 10 Commandments, all of which were referenced in my interviews. The True School movement is a conscious movement of social activists. It's a tight network, and they often employ hip-hop with some degree of spirituality. There are cosmic implications for them as they interact with hip-hop. Hip-hop is a tool set for them to foment change, right? I am hip-hop. This is a key indicator for people in the True School community. This is a term that KRS-One was coined in, I guess it was 1989, when he was talking about hip-hop as a cultural movement, right? True Schoolers are almost completely underground based on the vast amount of other hip-hop or rap music that we see in the mainstream. Again, Golden Age association. True School and Golden Age have tight links. In Atlanta, True Schoolers and underground hip-hop are networked around underground radio stations or college radio stations, and the community that I worked with is specifically networked around WRFG-FM community radio station centered in Little Five Points, a very progressive part of Atlanta, Georgia. Minister Server did a lot of work at WRFG and is part of this community, this True School community. He's an elder. He's an ordained unity minister. He's known as the hip-hop life coach, and he practices all elements except for urban dance because he's kind of too fresh on the style to be getting all dirty, spinning around on the floor. He's a representative of the Temple of Hip-Hop and has been KRS-One's spiritual advisor for many years. He works for the city of Atlanta as a youth programs coordinator and is part of several underground collectives and organizations dedicated to empowerment through hip-hop culture. He's a writer, a lecturer. He speaks at conferences, conventions, universities, and other events around the country, and has had several shows on WRFG radio station focusing on hip-hop culture and social justice, and continues to work through multiple arenas for this. Professor Griff, many of you may already know through Public Enemy. He's kind of a big deal. He's hip-hop's Minister of Information, and this was one of the best interviews I had, and it was one of the hardest to secure, but it was awesome. He's spectacular. He's nationally recognized as a lecturer and an educator on hip-hop, on music business, and on blackness, and on the cosmic implications of hip-hop. He works locally with many nonprofits across a range of issues like food security, housing, self-defense training, educational outreach, spiritual outreach, and other things. He's published multiple books, done hundreds of interviews, and been on more than a dozen albums. Like Server, he provides mentorship to young people in the community, several of which I was fortunate enough to do interviews with as part of my sample. So these two gentlemen went through a kind of rough period in 2008. In two unrelated incidences, both Server and Professor Griff lost almost everything they owned in house fires. Like Server's house caught on fire a few months after Griff's house blew up after some shady technicians had been monkeying around in his basement. I don't know what to say. He has nothing positive to say about it, and it didn't sound really good. You know, get some technicians in the house, and then it blows up. Anyways, they lost everything they owned. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but they lost absolutely everything they owned, both of them. And in addition to their personal effects were a wide range of cultural material that was very important to the True School community. Books, magazines, albums, a bunch of original data that wasn't archived anywhere else. They were part of this archive. And so this loss was pretty profound for the community at large. And the community came together to support them in every way that they could. All right, the first thing that they did was have this concert. There were a few other concerts and a few other things, but I'm just going to talk about this concert, right? The 4th of July concert was held at the 5 Spot in Little Five Points, just down the street from WRFG radio station. And everyone that I interviewed, aside from one person, was involved directly with planning, organizing, or implementing this, right? People gave their time, people gave their attendance, people gave their emotional support, people gave their spiritual support of these elders in getting this together, right? This came in hugs, kisses, food, clothing, shelter, and most importantly, money. It generated almost $15,000 overall for them, which was split right down the middle. And while it didn't necessarily get them to a point of flourishing again, which it's arguable to say that they weren't in a flourishing point to begin with, it did get them back on their feet. It did act as a community safety net. These people said that their community works as community, as family, and that they support each other. And their actions met their words. So the way they define community has been legitimized, in my opinion, right? Now, the way some other anthropologists or sociologists might define community may be a little different, but I think it also fits there. Ferdinand Tönnies was one of the first people to really start community studies, and he talked about Gemeinschaft and Gesellschaft, which is community and society, right? And so community, for him, is this tight-knit, often rural, small-scale type of organization with a lot of shared resources in between people at a personal level, whereas society is this urban, industrialized type of modality of organization where people are kind of isolated from each other and there isn't a lot of interplay. And I suggest that true schoolers have built community inside of a larger society, and based on their lack of access to other things, they have had to create these small-scale networks of support, which I also think works for the African American community. Based on Melvin Oliver's work, he did a bunch of work in Los Angeles in the 80s, and the short of it is that his community save model describes African American communities as tight-knit, strong kin-like organizations or neighborhoods maintained through provisions of support and sociability. They're homogeneous networks organized around geography or activities like work, and that's exactly what I found with the community that I worked with in Atlanta. They're all African American, they're all in a geographically similar area, and they're all involved with cultural work around hip-hop, not to mention the actual music industry, the underground music industry of hip-hop. They work together, they share resources, they show up at each other's events. They are community that way, right? Suzanne Keller takes this a little bit further and provides us with this bedrock of community surrounding this transcendental spirit of community that I found to be the ethos, or this golden rule that kept showing up in my interviews, right? So I'll just quickly address these points that she describes, right? Turf and territory. Everyone's in Atlanta, right? Many of these people are transplants from the Northeast. They're all this diaspora, this true school diaspora inside of Atlanta, and they come together through that, and they have a progressive hub of Little 5 Points. In terms of their modes of relatedness, they have strong volunteer networks with a lot of crossover, right? They have a strong business community in the underground music scene, and again, as I said earlier, they all support each other by showing up to each other's events. In terms of their leadership structure, well, Professor Griff and Minister Server are leaders in this community based on their visibility through national organizations like Public Enemy or the Temple of Hip Hop, but more importantly, through the vast amount of work that they do on the ground for their community, right? Rituals and celebrations. The 4th of July concert is a perfect example of this. They come together to support each other, to have fun, peace, love, unity, and having fun, right? This concert is still going on, and there are a wide range of other events that people go to, a bunch of rituals that they're involved in to support one another in the community. They have a myth and an image of community. I am hip-hop. All respondents describe their community as a neighborhood, as a family, and they have a common goal of growing and sustaining their hip-hop community. They have a belief system. It's this heterodoxical fusion of Islam, of Christianity, of Pan-African thought, of black nationalism, and it comes together, this flexible, constantly changing, constantly growing framework that basically centers around generalized reciprocity and mutual respect. What's mine is yours, what's yours is mine. Do unto others as you'll have them do unto you. This basic tenet, which is common in a lot of community definitions, right? So, what have I got left? Institutional frameworks. Institutional frameworks like WRFG, like the Temple of Hip Hop, right? Like the Shrine of the Black Madonna. All these different places that foster hip-hop ideology, foster hip-hop identity, foster the community, the success of the community, come together, and at the same time inform blackness. They come together, in my opinion, really fit well with Suzanne Keller's model here. So, in conclusion, what I basically learned and why I think this matters is that hip-hop and blackness are mutually informative. They overlap. They're not the same, but if you're careful, you can understand one through the other and vice versa. True schoolers say they're a community, they act like a community, and that community can be defined in academic terms consistently. Their words and their actions are consistent. They say they support one another in their words, and I've seen that in their action, I think, right? They have created a community safety net for one another. And it's my hope that by using fieldwork and focusing on community over culture, we can add credibility and credence to the work that hip-hoppers are doing, more specifically, true schoolers are doing at home and abroad, because I've seen the same work in other parts of the world and other parts of the country. This is a movement that is extending beyond Atlanta. It's clear, and I was fortunate enough to see some of this in South Africa, which, again, I'll be happy to talk to you about any other time. Additionally, I'm hoping that this work opens doors for other people and for dialogue to kind of focus on community over culture in hip-hop, because I think it really grounds this higher dialogue on the ground with people. And for me, that's what's most important. So I know this was a little condensed, but I appreciate you taking some time. So if you have any questions or comments, now would be the time. And real quickly, I think these tags are really gorgeous. They say thank you in 3 different languages, and one's from Berlin, one's from Paris, and one's from LA. So it's danke, merci, and thank you. So thank you very much for your time and your patience earlier on, and I'd like to...
Nice job, Andy.
Thanks.